Hello again, and welcome to the Castle Old Skull Hawk Moor project, where we explore the deepest roots of Dungeons & Dragons in search of greater understanding and forgotten details that we can use to move forward into the future of old school-inspired game design. Today we are looking at the Conan tale The Scarlet Citadal by Robert E. Howard. This story is important because it is the tale that literally contains a dungeon crawl which inspired Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. It also led to Gary mentioning Conan as one of the major influences and touchstones for their January 1974 release of a new game, Dungeons & Dragons. As we read in Howard's tale, the lion strode through the halls of hell, across his path grim shadows fell, of many a mowing, nameless shape, monsters with dripping jaws agape. The darkness shuddered with scream and yell when the lion stalked through the halls of hell. And as Gary related in his foreword to the Dungeons & Dragons game, written November 1st, 1973, to quote, "These rules are strictly fantasy. Those wargamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Edgar Rice Burroughs' Martian adventures, where John Carter is groping through black pits, who feel no thrill upon reading Howard's Conan saga, who do not enjoy the De Camp and Pratt fantasies, or Fritz Lieber's Fafford and the Grey Mouser pitting their swords against evil sorceries, will not be likely to find Dungeons & Dragons to their taste. But those whose imaginations know no bounds will find that these rules are the answer to their prayers." And Conan was the real force of imagination behind Gary's conception of dungeon design as featured in the game. As Gary once noted in the Underworld question and answer threads, when asked of the origins of D&D, he replied to quote, "My real impetus was Howard's Conan, not surprisingly." It is also worth noting that Howard appears to be the one major influence which both Gygax and Arneson regularly agreed upon with great enthusiasm. Gary was also known to have been rereading the excellent Ballantine editions of Howard's Conan stories, a series which begins with The Coming of Conan. In 2007 he was reading this, which indicates that his admiration of Howard was certainly lifelong. And most of the most evocative passages concerning dungeons in the Conan tales are found within the Scarlet Citadal. We will discuss things like the Tower of the Elephant and Red Nails on another day. Much like Tolkien's portrayals of Moria and the goblin caves riddling the Misty Mountains, the Scarlet Citadel is particularly important to our understanding of old-school dungeons because in that tale, Howard describes nameless pits below the hill whereupon a palace sat. This is rather similar to Gary's conception of Castle Greyhawk, where Gary tells us that Dungeons & Dragons entails adventures where brave delvers engage in their first descent into the dungeons beneath the huge ruined pile, a vast castle built by generations of mad wizards and insane geniuses. The following passage from Howard's tale, where indeed we learn about deadly dungeons, monsters created by an evil wizard named Sothalanti, and bardic rumors of horrific encounters overheard by an adventurer, is particularly interesting. It reads as follows. He, Conan, glared fearsomely at the outer gloom, and thought of the grisly tales he had heard of Sotha's necromantic cruelty, and it was with an icy sensation down his spine that he realized that these must be the very halls of horror, named in shuddering legendry, the tunnels and dungeons wherein Sotha performed horrible experiments with beings human, bestial, and, it is whispered, demoniac, tampering blasphemously with the naked basic elements of life itself. Rumors said that the mad poet Rinaldo had visited these pits and been shown horrors by the wizard, and that the nameless monstrosities of which he hinted in his awful poem, The Song of the Pit, were no mere fantasies of a disordered brain. Clearly, the halls of horror were a significant inspiration for the dungeons of Greyhawk in 1973. This also appears to be a major impetus for written passages found in the later Monster Manual of 1977, where we learn specifically of mad wizards creating various monsters. For example, in the description for Tim Kask's Boulet monster, otherwise known as the Bullet or land shark, we hear that they were originally created from a mad wizard's experimental crossbreeding of a snapping turtle and armadillo with infusions of demon's ichor. This makes the scene in Gary's story told in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons coloring album, where we see a land shark erupting out of the netherworld to attack the adventurers who dare to approach Castle Greyhawk, quite resonant with the legacy of Sotha-Lanti and other mad wizards of his kind. Later in the Monster Manual, we read too that the horrible owlbear is probably the result of genetic experimentation by some insane wizard. We also find in Book 2 of original Dungeons & Dragons references to Dave Arneson's dungeon cleanup crew, which are the various slimes that absorb adventurers as well as the dead remains of other denizens from the deep. No doubt these creatures would have an origin in the Mad Wizard's alchemical experiments as well. And as an aside, Gary Gygax would probably later use Robert E. Howard's created name Sotha-Lanti as inspiration for his own ancient wizard name Sajkonth because of the beginning construction TSO, but that is a tale for another time. And the legacy of the latest Mad Wizard is found in the manifestation of many other monsters down below. Conan in the story learns much of this ancestry through his own unwilling explorations of the halls of horror. As we read, "The tunnels were not silent. From the bowels of the earth in all directions came sounds that did not belong in a sane world. There were titterings, squeals of demoniac mirth, long shuddering howls, and once the unmistakable squalling laughter of a hyena ended awfully in human words of shrieking blasphemy. Conan heard the pad of stealthy feet, and in the mouths of the tunnels he caught glimpses of shadowy forms, monstrous and abnormal in outline. It was as if he had wandered into hell, a hell of the mad wizard Sotha-Lanti's making." There is a further point that is usually not considered these days, which is that the Castle Greyhawk of Gary Gygax was specifically created by a descendant lineage of wizards and madmen and dug deeper over time. When we read of Sotha's need for the dungeons as a place to hold monstrous and demonic creatures for his empowering necromantic experiments, it becomes rather interesting to think about who the very first builder of Castle Greyhawk might have been. Howard's story there might be of a bit of help, where we find that Sotha-Lanti came to power in his own palace after the rightful king had been disposed of. It reads as follows: "Did Sotha dig these pits for no other reason than to house his accursed monstrosities?" asked Conan. "He did not dig them," the wizard Peleus answered. "When the city was founded 3,000 years ago, there were ruins of an earlier city on and about this hill. King Cossus V, the founder, built his palace on the hill, and digging cellars beneath it, he came upon a walled-up doorway, which he broke into and discovered the pits, which were about as we see them now. But his Grand Vizier came to such a grisly end in the pits that Cossus, in his fright, walled up the entrance again. He said the Vizier fell into a well, but he had the cellars filled in, and later abandoned the palace itself, and he built himself another palace in the suburbs, from which he fled in a panic on discovering that some black mold scattered on the marble floor of his palace one morning. He then departed with his whole court to the eastern corner of the kingdom and built a new city. The palace on the hill was not used and fell into ruins. When Akutho I revived the lost glories of Korshemish, he built a fortress there. It remained for Sotha-Lanti to rear the Scarlet Citadal and open the way to the pits once again. Whatever fate overtook the Grand Vizier of Caucasus, Sotholanti avoided it. He fell into no well, though he did descend into a well that he found, and came out with a strange expression which has not since left his eyes. And today's lesson for game design from all of this consideration of Conan and Castle Greyhawk and the early days of the Lake Geneva campaign, quite simply it's this. The mega dungeon is a netherworld city in itself, with thousands of years of history that no one person understands. The adventurers who brave its halls are only the latest generation of brave fools who are tampering with ancient horrors that they do not understand. These ruined castles with mega dungeons beneath them are revealed by Howard, and through inspiration on down by Gygax, as ancient netherworld cities built atop Lovecraftian underworlds, and then various generations of kings and mad wizards build up castles until one of them digs too deep and releases the imprisoned horrors that the ancients had attempted to wall up long ago. And indeed, the Lovecraftian link in Howard's tales has always been there, as we know, with Howard starting correspondence with Lovecraft in August of 1930, and the Scarlet Citadal was written in the spring of 1932, then published in January 1933. We can see, too, that the city itself arises as a result of this nexus of blasphemous power, with the ages passing on through caverns filled with monsters and the implied legacies of the serpent folk and giant snakes, then with a cultic temple above, then a town growing into a city, then falling into ruins, and then other people being lured and coming to the place of obvious power, with wise, self-preserving people eventually leaving the ruins alone, then building up a new city somewhere else. But of course, the bold adventurers still come forth in their hundreds and thousands over the many ages in search of treasure and glory. Gary Gygax may have used this legacy of passing eons and dungeon layers and a thriving city in his own campaign ideas, and I certainly do that too in my World of Old Skull campaign, and the secret history of the free city-state of Grimrock as well. So if you are ever looking for inspiration, justification, legacy, or unholy inspiration for the existence of mega dungeons in your old school dungeon campaign, you can begin with a reading of the works of H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, Dave Arneson and his Blackmoor Castle, and the dungeon modules of E. Gary Gygax. I hope you have found some inspiration herein. Until next time, hold your swords and torches high against the darkness, and journey well.